I'm going to be talking to Mark Winfield, who's a professor of environmental studies at York University, about an article he recently published in The Conversation titled How the War in Ukraine Will Shape Canada's Energy Policy. So, welcome to the interview, Mark.
Good afternoon, Markham.
So, you've got a number of issues here that you address in your op-ed, I guess. The first one is that Canada will face pressures both domestically and internationally to increase the production of hydrocarbons, oil and gas. What's your take on that?
Well, I think it's an open question, but certainly we're hearing those voices already. And Canada does occupy this position, which has been now reemphasized rather strongly, as a geopolitically stable and secure source of energy supply. And so that has inevitably led to questions, especially now that we're into a conversation about terminating Russian oil and gas exports. Canada does come up as among the potential candidates as potential alternative suppliers.
Well, that leads us to your next issue, which is the calls for new export infrastructure. Now, this got complicated since your article was published because just a few days ago, earlier this week, TC Energy, the proponent for the Keystone XL pipeline, confirmed to a journalist that they have no intentions of reviving that project. And that, of course, has been one of the favorite hobby horses for Alberta and Premier Jason Kenney to get President Biden to reconsider his decision to cancel the permit. So, what does that leave us with?
Well, that is one of the complications, is that there is no easy, immediate way to increase, for example, Canadian oil exports to Europe that were tied to the existing infrastructures that such as it is to the Gulf Coast. Energy East is the other one that's come up. Of course, in both cases, even if they were to be given green lights, it would be years before they could actually do anything particularly useful that way. And one of the underlying questions here is the shift in demand going to be temporary or permanent? I mean, the Europeans at this stage, among other things, are now signaling very strongly that their intention is to double down on decarbonization very, very strongly. They've kind of learned their lesson, that the idea that you could have ended up in this symbiotic economic relationship with Russia, which would make what's now happening unimaginable, clearly has failed. And we always knew this was part of the rationale for the European energy transitions anyway. It was seen as an energy security issue. That's now just been put into the forefront. So there's a question there about whether by the time we did anything on the oil side, the Europeans would be interested anymore. There's other suppliers, the Saudis have come up in terms of they could just pump more as opposed to have to build new infrastructures. The other one that's raises some questions for Canada, and indeed may be more relevant, of course, is the liquid natural gas questions in British Columbia, where some of those projects have been stalled. The economics have turned out to be much more marginal than were thought, and that may change if we do see global gas prices go up as well. If you're seeing a more general embargo, they're in the pipeline, but again, not really in a position to make an overnight transition in terms of the ability to supply Europe.
Let's go back to pipelines for a moment. I had an interview recently with Richard Masson, who's an executive fellow with the School of Public Policy at University of Calgary. And his position, and I agree with this wholeheartedly, in fact, I wrote my first column about it in 2019, is that there will never be another pipeline built in Canada. And whatever incremental exports there are now will come from innovation that frees up, some spare capacity in the existing pipeline system, or an increase in oil by rail. And that actually, from Canada's point of view, I think makes a lot more sense because rail is flexible. You can scale it up, scale it down as demand. You have the option to go to different markets if that's what's required. And then you're not stuck with stranded assets, 50-year stranded assets. What's your take on that?
Well, there is some flexibility, although there are limitations, and there are some physical assets you do have to deal with, even with rail, in terms of your ability to load and unload, for example, which is not necessarily that easy. There are other problems that flow that we, of course, keep in mind, we are building one big pipeline to British Columbia as it is at cost that seems to keep growing every time we look. The downside with the risk with rail, of course, there are limitations to capacity. We are in the process, theoretically, of turning over the tanker fleets in the aftermath of Lac-Mégantic. The questions that arose there on safety questions are still there in the law in the main. The basic regulatory regime that allowed Lac-Mégantic to happen is still there. It hasn't been altered that much. So there are concerns on the environmental side there. There are capacity concerns because, of course, what happened last time as well is we saw tank car fleets that had basically been parked on storage racks brought back into service very quickly. So we need to be very conscious about that. And you even then say you do run into some physical limitations in terms of capacity at, for example, Irving in New Brunswick, for example, which would be the closest port to Europe, or even on the Gulf Coast. There are some limitations there. So that these are possibilities. But then there's even this larger question, which is now raised too, is if the overall global trajectory is towards decarbonization, is the market going to be there if you built big, long-lived, expensive infrastructures? Are you going to discover you've got a stranded asset?
Well, let's talk about one of the sources of low emission electricity, which is nuclear. And you've seen calls from the nuclear advocates, in the wake of the Russian invasion. What's your take on that?
Well, I think it's a complicated set of questions. Again, for Canada, I don't think it changes that dynamic very much domestically. The same questions we had before are still there, but whether this makes any sense in terms of, given the experience with costs and other factors, as a decarbonization strategy. In Europe, it's somewhat more complicated because clearly we've had the IEA and others, say, well, part of the strategy could be certainly some continued role, if not some expanded role, for nuclear, and you're hearing that from the French and other people too. The politics in Europe, though, I think are going to get very complicated there. And indeed, those sensitivities, if anything, the war has reinforced them enormously. That with the overrunning of the Chernobyl site and the issues there, and then the battle at the other nuclear facility in Ukraine, which is very dangerous. I was quite surprised at the strength with which the head of the IAEA spoke about that and his concerns, which were quite stark coming from what is normally a very conservative regulator. Plus Putin's implied nuclear threats. I'm not sure where public opinion in Europe is going to go. It may not be viable. I mean, I think the pressures around renewables are much clearer. The political consensus around that is going to be much clearer. So I think that part is clearer in terms of where Europe's going to go. Where nuclear fits into this equation, I think is still going to be an open question, because as much as there's been pressure, gee, this is potentially attractive, there's also a lot of reminders happening that are very direct to European experience. Say that's why we decided we weren't going to go there. And the other problem, of course, is the nuclear fuel in Europe isn't coming from Europe. It's coming from other places. So there's a lot of challenges in that space.
Let me flag an issue then. As Europe shifts more to renewable energy over the next, between now and 2030, and that is the outsized role that China plays in manufacturing things like batteries, wind turbines, and solar panels. Now, if I think I've got my numbers correct here. But China has 90% of the world's battery manufacturing capacity, 70% of its wind turbine capacity, and 50% of its solar capacity. And it has strong ties to Putin and Russia. So it'll be very interesting to see, how Europe fares with that. Can they scale up their access to those technologies in a timely fashion, or are they going to have to wait for China? And if they do, then how will China just treat it as a commercial exchange, or do politics come into play?
Again, it can be complicated. I mean, for the Europeans, in some cases, it's more a question of reanimating their their manufacturing activities, which were, initially quite strong, and then were offshored to China. And so clearly, again, I mean, in Europe, the energy transition has become an energy security question. And I think that and a national security question as well. So I would imagine that you would see some interest in onshoring these activities. I mean, the supply chains, particularly around rare earth minerals and other things, are not as quite, China has a large stake, but others are potential players in that space as well, including North America. The other geopolitical consideration here is that China's overall economic relationship with Europe is vastly larger than its economic relationship with Russia. And so it may also have reasons not to want to disrupt those relationships too much. I mean, this has been part of the larger conversation about China's role in this whole situation, is that their economic ties to Russia are marginal compared to other places. So again, an unknown in terms of how this plays out, but I would tend to think the Europeans would definitely be turning their minds to how much can we onshore these supply chains because of this link now that's so explicit between energy and security.
Mark, thank you very much for your insights. Always appreciate them.
Great. Thank you, Markham.